He ordered a corpse to stand trial. He dressed the dead man in papal robes. He forced a deacon to speak for him. What followed was mutilation, river burial, and a shockwave that nearly destroyed the papacy. In January 897, Rome tasted something ugly and new. Power and faith braided into a single act of revenge. The man who sat on the papal throne that winter wanted not only to punish an enemy, he wanted to erase him. The weapon he chose was a court. The defendant was a corpse. This is the Cadaver Synod. The trial was legal theater. It would test canon law, break traditions, and send a message louder than any sermon. But how did the church reach a point where law needed a body to be convincing? The answer starts in faction, fear, and a papacy that had become a prize. 9th century Rome was not a quiet spiritual center. It was a battlefield. The Carolingian world had fragmented. Local warlords and noble houses filled the vacuum. Kings in distant courts tugged at Rome like puppet masters. The papacy had value beyond piety. It conferred legitimacy. It confirmed bishops. It crowned kings. That made it irresistible to political brokers. Popes were installed and deposed like governors. Violence, exile, and forged elections were routine. Into that chaos stepped Formosus. Formosus was no saintly recluse. He was a career cleric and diplomat. He had been bishop, papal legate, and a thorn to several rulers. He spent years maneuvering in courts across Italy and beyond. Those maneuvers made allies and many enemies. Formosus allied with Arnulf of Carinthia against the faction centered in Spoleto. That alignment cost him support among powerful Roman nobles.
When Formosus became pope in 891, he carried baggage more than blessing. His enemies watched for an opening. Formosus, ambitious, seasoned, controversial. He made political bets that enraged rivals. Those rivals would not forgive him in life. They would not stop in death. Stephen VI, he was not a man elevated by consensus. He returned to Rome, backed by the Spoleto faction. He had personal and political motives to strike at Formosus's legacy. Stephen believed legitimacy could be stolen back by a court verdict. He believed the law could be used as a weapon. The Spoletans and other nobles, they circled the papacy like predators. They needed a public, undeniable verdict to delegitimize Formosus and everyone he had ordained. That would strip power from their opponents across Italy. This trial was not mere vengeance. It was strategic law. In medieval Christendom, the validity of orders and sacraments hinged on proper ordination. If Formosus was declared illegitimate, then every bishop, abbot, and priest he had ordained could be declared invalid. That would unmake networks of power. The verdict would cascade through dioceses and courts. It would alter who could rule and who could crown. The synod promised to do what assassination could not. It would rewrite legitimacy on paper and in public. Formosus died in April 896. The city breathed for a moment, but death did not end the dispute. His enemies feared his ordinations more than his presence. They worried that his supporters would build authority from each consecration he had performed. Words on parchment were insufficient. They wanted spectacle. They wanted a public humiliation so complete that memory itself would be altered. Stephen VI seized that opening. He convened a synod at the Lateran. The charges were formal.
They accused Formosus of having been Bishop of Porto when he sought the papacy. They accused him of perjury, of coveting another see, and of political betrayal for aligning with foreign kings. Those were canonical issues. They could, in theory, annul his acts. In practice, the law had never been tested in this way. The court's logic was perverse. It sought to punish the dead, to invalidate the living. Many canonists recoiled. Some clerics feared precedent. Still, pressure from nobles and the visibility of the papal throne stamped the plan with inevitability. The synod's decision took an extraordinary step. The body would be produced. Formosus's tomb was opened. The corpse was dragged into daylight. It had already begun to decompose. Servants tied it upright. They dressed it in papal vestments. A deacon stood beside the inert mouth and answered for him. Stephen presided. The hall filled with clergy, nobles, and citizens, drawn by morbid curiosity. Incense tried and failed to mask the smell of rot. The court began. Charges were read. Witnesses spoke. The defendant did not speak. The farce wore the robes of law. They could have read verdicts from a scroll. They chose instead to stage a drama. The question was not whether Formosus would be condemned. The question was how far the church would go to make that condemnation real. They sought penalties that would ripple across Christendom. What sentence did they pronounce? And what violence followed the verdict, inside and outside the basilica?
The outcome was predetermined. Formosus was declared guilty on every count: perjury, violating canon law, and blasphemously coveting the papal seat while still Bishop of Porto. But Stephen VI wanted more than words on parchment. He wanted vengeance made visible. Before the council, the dead pope was stripped of his sacred robes. The papal ring, symbol of divine authority, was torn from his withered finger. Then came an act so cruel it burned itself into history. The court ordered the 3 fingers Formosus once used to bless the faithful to be cut off. Each finger dropped to the floor, a grotesque trophy of Stephen's triumph. Rome watched in disbelief. Some whispered that Stephen had gone mad. Others said he was possessed. But the synod pressed on. The verdict decreed that all of Formosus's acts as pope were invalid. Every ordination, every blessing, every decree erased. Bishops he had appointed were stripped of title. Priests he had ordained were declared frauds. It was not just the body of Formosus on trial. It was the entire church he had built. When the ceremony ended, the court did not stop. The corpse was dragged from its chair and dumped into the streets. Soldiers paraded it through Rome, the once holy body of a pope, now a mockery. The city, sickened by the spectacle, grew restless. The people of Rome had endured wars, invasions, and famine, but never this. The pope had tried a corpse. The church, in their eyes, had lost its soul. The mob watched as the mutilated body was thrown into a pauper's grave. Yet Stephen still feared its memory. He ordered the remains dug up once more and cast into the river Tiber. The current swallowed Formosus, and Stephen believed he had finally silenced his rival forever. But in Rome, nothing buried stays buried for long. Rumors spread almost immediately. Fishermen swore that the body of Formosus washed ashore days later, caught in reeds near the Vatican.
Others claimed it had floated to the surface.
incorrupt and serene, a sign of divine defiance. Pilgrims began to gather at the riverbanks, whispering prayers to the disgraced pope. The tide of opinion shifted. What Stephen meant as humiliation became martyrdom. The outrage was unstoppable. Nobles who had stood behind Stephen now feared the anger of the crowd. Bishops who had sat silently through the synod now called it a sin against the church. Within months, rebellion erupted in the streets of Rome. Rioters stormed the papal palace, dragging Stephen VI from his throne. He was imprisoned, stripped of the papal robes he had once wrapped around a corpse. Sometime later, accounts differ whether by mob or by order, Stephen VI was strangled to death in his cell. The papacy he had tried to purify was now tainted beyond repair. A year later, a new pope, Theodore II, was elected. His first act was to denounce the Cadaver Synod. He ordered the body of Formosus to be retrieved from the Tiber and buried again, this time with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The church tried to heal, to erase the nightmare of a dead man's trial. But the scandal had ignited something larger. The legitimacy of popes, the authority of canon law, and the credibility of the church itself were now in question. Successive popes were forced to issue decrees reaffirming that no dead man could ever again be tried. Yet the precedent of the Cadaver Synod lingered like a wound, a reminder that even sacred institutions could descend into madness. The Cadaver Synod became legend, whispered in monasteries and retold by historians as proof of how politics can corrupt faith. For centuries, the Church avoided even mentioning it, but it remains a mirror, showing what happens when power forgets restraint, when vengeance dresses itself in holy garments, and when justice is performed not for truth, but for spectacle. A pope once judged a corpse, but in the end, history judged him. If this story of madness and power fascinated you, then journey deeper into history's unanswered mysteries. Watch The Death of Alexander the Great, Accident, Illness, or Murder, available now on Secrets of History. And if you believe the past still speaks through stories like this, like, share, comment, and subscribe, because the world has forgotten many secrets, and we're here to uncover them all.